Okay, so the part of this that is drawn from new research is at the end. So I need to give you some basic stuff, information about Brazil, before we can go anywhere, in terms of race, and in terms of race, really. So first of all, for those of you that don't know, Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world in terms of population. That number is a little old, but it's pretty good. It's about 190 million now. And then in terms of gross domestic product, it's around number 11. It kind of goes up and down, but it's a pretty big, it's got a huge economy. And right now it's doing particularly well economically. And so that actually makes doing research a lot nicer in general, except for the fact that the dollar is weak vis-a-vis the real, which means everything's expensive. This shows you the size of Brazil. It is the same size as the United States, except lengthwise as opposed to width. And so it's really the same as the United States, same size. Now, when we talk about comparatively about race and color in Brazil and the US, it's really important to recall the numbers of slaves brought to the New World, to the Western Hemisphere. And so this slide shows you the numbers of slaves, the number of slaves that were brought from between 1451 and 1870. And the interesting things to notice on this is that Brazil, the number of slaves brought to Brazil was over 4 million. And what became the United States, these are the new estimate numbers, 523,000. That's a huge difference. And we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about the legacy of slavery and what it means for race and color in Brazil. Brazil received almost 40% of the slaves transported with the combined Caribbean, which if you combine all of the Caribbean numbers, it's almost about the same. It's just about the same. In the late 1700s, now this chart breaks it down in a different way, which is the Caribbean and then Brazil. So they're again about the same. This is the late 1700s. The U.S. just 575,000. This is the slave population. This isn't how many were brought. This is how many were actually living there. And then Spanish America, only 271,000, and that includes all of Spanish America. And this reveals a similar pattern, which is Brazil, again, and the Caribbean are very high. The U.S. is the same number, basically the same number as in the French West Indies. So you can see that. And the U.S., of course, was much larger. French West Indies was really tiny, but that is something to consider as well. The total population of Brazil at the end of the 18th century, when this number isn't really relevant, was about 4.4 million. In other words, the whole population of Brazil in the late 1700s was about 4.4 million. So slaves constituted a quarter of the population in the late 1700s. Now, in the significance of these figures, and why am I showing you this? But it's important to realize that the significance of these figures is the subject of a lot of scholarship. These facts are used to explain all sorts of things, including the greater acceptance of African-descended people in the general population of Brazil, as well as to support the now debunked view that racism is gentler, that slavery was gentler, and that racism is not as virulent in Brazil as it is in the United States. And that has been debunked, both of those views. So then here we are, we're talking about the census, and so I thought it would be interesting to show you the U.S. Census categories. And they're the U.S. Census and their race categories between 1850 and 1990. And I'll just mention a few of them to see how things have changed and how the politics of a particular time really affect census categories. So in 1850, which of course is before the Civil War, there were only two categories, black and mulatto. 1870, you've got white, black, mulatto, Chinese, and Indian. Indian, not East Indian, the American Indian. 1890, you've got white, black, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. Now, everybody know what quadroon and octoroon are? Because that's when you have an ancestor, octoroon, which is 8, one ancestor that gives you 1/8 of black blood, quote unquote, that metaphor that we use for race in the United States. And a quadroon is a quarter. So one grandparent being black, then you would make you a quadroon. That didn't last long. From as you can see, that those categories disappear. And then I want to just switch quickly to 1930 to 1960, which is the period of legal segregation and in the South. And they say here the period of the one-drop rule, and you know what one-drop rule is in the United States is one drop of black blood makes you black, but one drop of white blood doesn't make you white. So during this period, we've got a change in terminology. So black becomes Negro, Mexican, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and then you can see this. One of the things that I found to be really interesting is that in 1960, you'll notice that we've got Hawaiian, Part-Hawaiian, Aleut, and Eskimo. Those categories disappeared later, but probably, I don't know, I would guess that it has to do with the admission of Hawaii and Alaska as states in the United States, so they probably wanted to figure out how many people. And then, of course, we come up to closer to the present, and I'm going to show you the form itself in a minute, so I'm not going to go over this. In Brazil, we've got a very different set of categories. So, and it's about the same period as in the United States that I showed you before. So in 1870, up there, they did ask the question. Notice the question. It's a color question. It's not a race question. There's no indication that the Brazilian census was ever concerned with this notion of race. It was always concerned with color. So we've got, in 1870, the categories are white, black, pardo, which is mixed white and black, and caboclo, which is mixed Indian and anybody else, white or black. So those are the categories in 1870, and then in 1900, there's no color question, which of course makes research, I mean, it's very difficult to research the history of color, the color categories in Brazil. In 1940, they simplified it to white, black, and yellow. And then in 1950, they added back in pardo, which is mixed, and they had yellow. 60, white, black, pardo, yellow, and they added an Indian in 1960. And then in 1970, they didn't ask the question. And there's the reason for that, I mean, the sort of analytical explanation for that, is that 1970 is the height of the military dictatorship. And one of the things that the military dictatorship of Brazil, the military government of Brazil, was very nationalistic. And part of the Brazilian national myth is that there is no race in Brazil, there is no racism in Brazil, there is no discrimination, there's just no reason to collect that information. So that's the reason that it wasn't asked in 1970. 80, we've got white, black, mixed, and yellow. And in 91, they added in race only to correspond to the new indigenous category. So this set of categories, black, white, black, mixed, yellow, they're all colors, whereas indigenous is considered a race. It makes none of it makes a whole lot of sense, but it makes a little bit more sense than the U.S. Census, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So that's not interesting. This is just a chart to give you a sense of how people identify. Now, self-identification actually only comes into being in pretty late. But so some of it is self-identification and some of it is the census taker makes a decision about what a person, quote unquote, is. So this just shows you the relationship between declared whites and then the black and mixed. If you add together the black and the mixed category, over half the population would be African descendant. And this would be the equivalent of the U.S. definition of African American, which is basically what dropped. So even though in Brazil there's a distinction made between mixed and black, if this were the United States, then the population of Brazil would be over half black. In 2000, the census categories were white, black, yellow, mixed, and indigenous. And you can see here that 91 million of the 176 million Brazilians considered themselves white in 2000. That's over half considered themselves white. So there's always a little bit of a give between white and non-white in Brazil, but it's generally been about half over the years. Okay, so now let's look at the U.S. Census category. And this is uma confusão mesmo, as we say in Portuguese. So it starts, so the U.S. Census this year started, as we learned in previous talks, is first it's interested in Hispanic origin and Latino. And I just want to point out that there is no Brazil here at all. And in fact, do we have any Brazilians in the room? Okay, so when Brazilians fill out the U.S. Census, they get very concerned because most Brazilians, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most Brazilians in the United States don't consider themselves to be Latino in the same way. So this creates a problem for Brazilians. But in any event, and there are a lot of Brazilians in the United States now. But this is a place where you choose if you are of Hispanic origin, because of course Hispanic means Spanish and Brazilians are of Portuguese origin, so that's another problem. So if you look at this question, it appears to be about ethnicity or nationality. This question is not about what we think of as race. So it could be ethnicity, or you could think of it in terms of nationality. If you think of Hispanic or Latino as being an ethnicity in the United States, then it would be ethnicity. But then if you look at the actual categories, they're national categories. So that's a little bit of a confusion there. And then when you get to the next question, you'll see that the question of race comes up here. What is this person's race? And one of the odd things is that the notion of race is actually, in this question, is actually conflated with nationality or ethnicity. So we wonder, I wonder, what could race mean in this context? It seems to be used in a different way in the census than it is in popular parlance. So the important thing so just to recap, the important thing to notice, it seems to me, in this comparison, is the absence of color in the United States Census and the presence of color in the Brazilian Census. And that, in a nutshell, is one of the big differences between Brazil and the United States, which is what this talk is supposed to give you a sense of. Now, race relations. We're finished with the census, okay? So now I want to move on to thinking about the difference between race relations in the US and Brazil. So both countries were faced with solving the problem of African descendant people after the abolition of slavery in both countries. Now, the United States abolished slavery in 1865. Brazil is the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. So, I mean, it's already the end of the 19th century, but then once slaves are free, or I don't think that a lot of black people don't feel as though slaves were ever free in Brazil. But once there's after the abolition of slavery, the country in both cases each country is faced with what they consider to be a problem. What do we do about these large numbers of African descended or black people? Many of them had been slaves. But one of the big differences between Brazil and the United States, slavery and African Americans in the United States and Brazil, is that in the United States, there were very, very few free people of color. The vast, it was almost like 90 some odd percent, I forget, 98% of African descended people in the United States were slaves. In Brazil, there was a very large contingent of what are called free people of color. And so that is a population that's not the same as former slaves. So you've got a difference there. In terms of solving this quote-unquote problem, in Brazil, what they decided to do was to encourage European immigration on the theory that the black people in Brazil would marry the white people who would come from Europe and would whiten, they call it whitening, and this is true in Hispanic America as well, whitening the population. The idea being that if you mix black and white, you're going to come up with something lighter than black. Of course, what I call genetic roulette, you never know what you're going to have. You don't know what some person is going to look like. You can have white parents and black children. In Brazil, you can have brothers and sisters, some of them are white and some of them are black and some of them are mixed, which of course isn't something that you can have in the United States, at least until now, unless you've adopted a child. So they encouraged this European immigration and they were interested in whitening the population. In the United States, we have exactly the opposite decision, which is to keep the races, right, black and white, separate, completely separate. So that in many states, up until Loving versus Virginia was like 1967, intermarriage between white and black people was illegal. So in every possible way, the law in the United States, and especially in the South, made it really difficult for white and black people to intermarry. The next point on this is this Gilberto Freire. He was an anthropologist. I always like to point that out. Very, very important. He actually came to the United States and studied with, he was at I think, Rice. And he also worked with Franz Boas at Columbia. And he was in the United States in the 20s, and he was absolutely outraged by the segregation. It just totally blew him away because he's coming from Brazil. He goes back to Brazil and he says, well, Brazil is better than the United States because we have this mixture. And one of the things that he's reacting against is 19th century scientific racism, one of the tenets of which was mixture is bad. That people who are mixed race are actually unhealthy, physically unhealthy, dumber, all these sorts of things. And one of the things that Gilberto Freire did was he popularized the idea that no, Brazil is better because of race mixing. And he is known as the person who popularized this notion of, and you see it on the next slide, racial democracy. The idea that Brazil is a racial democracy. It's an ideology, and it was important at the time because it countered the scientific racism. The problem is that starting in the 1950s, social scientists started challenging this ideology of racial democracy And in fact, after about 1980, we really only refer to it as the myth of racial democracy, because Brazil, in fact, whatever racial democracy means, which is a whole other question, we could write a whole paper on that. But racial democracy is actually not, is a myth. And so then you say, well, how could that be? And the point is that cordial relations, one of the things that people notice when they go to Brazil is, oh, black and white people, they get along so well together, you don't have that tension. We talk about the United States, there's tension in the cities and stuff. But horizontal cordial relations between people is not the same as equality, which is vertical. So that's what we started seeing in the 50s and 60s. They started doing this research, and this is have you seen this before? Anybody ever seen this painting before? This is a fabulous painting. This was done in 1895. It was first shown in 1895. It's called The Redemption of Pain. Think about the implications of that name. Okay, so this is a grandma, and she's black, right? And this is her daughter, and she's lighter skinned. And the daughter marries a Portuguese, white. And the baby is even lighter still. And what is the grandma doing? She's thanking God for the whitening of her family. So it's a double-edged sword, right? It's good that people are intermarrying. It's good that people are getting along with each other. But whiteness is still the value. That's the value, is being white. So unlike the United States, where you can't become white, and white is valued, or was valued for a very long time, in Brazil, you can become white. I mean, in your family. Your family can change its color over time. So that racial inclusion and exclusion can actually coexist. And that is the paradox of Brazilian race relations. Ed Tellis, who's a sociologist, wonderful sociologist, who wrote a book called Race in Another America. His book is wonderful. If anybody's interested in reading more about the details about race in Brazil, that's the book to start with. And just as an illustration, this comes from his book, as an illustration of what he's talking about when he says racial inclusion and exclusion can coexist. Just notice this. The percentage of people that were polled in 1995 who agreed that whites hold prejudices against Negroes. That's not Negroes, it's Negroes. Okay? In white people said, 89% of white people said yes, 88% of brown people said yes, and 91% of black people said yes. At the same time, in the same poll, the percent agreeing that race mixture is a good thing, notice, same percentage. So you can have prejudice, and you can have social inclusion, you can have economic prejudice, you can have all that stuff existing at the same time. And in the United States, we're so much more used to the idea that everything goes together, that sometimes it's a little bit hard to contemplate. Now, I just wanted to briefly just show you the regions of Brazil. The reason I wanted to show you this is because race or color in Brazil isn't a standalone category. In fact, regional identity is as important in Brazil as color. And if you look at the regions of Brazil, and I'm going to show you in a minute another slide that'll show you the wealth in relation to the color of people. But so this is and shows you all the different regions. This is the Northeast. I don't want to spend much. Northeast is the area that I studied, or I did study, that I'm switching out of now. But notice this, Bahia. How many people have heard of Bahia? You heard of it, right? It's a place where you go to the beach, but it's also the Salvador, which is right there, is the city in Brazil that has the largest number of black people, and it's also sort of the center of Afro-Brazilian cultural celebration, and so a lot of people go there for that. This shows you the intersection of poverty. This doesn't show you the intersection, it shows you poverty, and I like this map because this is a map where the red states are the poorest. So it's kind of different. And you can see that the Northeast, this area here, including Bahia, which is the state with the largest number of black people, is also the poorest. And down here, these are the white areas, very white areas, and like German immigration and all, and British and all that. This is the richest. The intersection here of the Human Development Index shows you that the darker states have a lower Human Development Index than whiter states. So you see the intersection of economics and race in Brazil, not that different from the history of the United States. And just so that you can see that the regional differences, so in the Northeast, 33% of people say that they're white. That means it's a vast majority of people see themselves as not white. Whereas in Rio and Sao Paulo, 62% see themselves as white. And in the South, 84% see themselves as white. So you have these regions. When we talk about regions in the United States, and we talk about the North and the South, we have a very different image of the North and the South than people in Brazil do of their North and their South. And it's very strong for them. Very strong. Their regional identity is extremely powerful. So the reason that I wanted to tell you that is I just want to briefly mention a little bit about a new project that I was doing research on when I had my leave in the fall, and I did a little bit more on it this summer. And the title of it is Punishing Police Impunity, Racial Insult and Remedy in Brazil. And this addresses racial discrimination in Brazil. So in this new project, I'm considering how racial/regional insults by police can lead to lawsuits that pay damages to the person who's falsely arrested, often because of the color of the person's skin. And I just want to tell you, I think I have like 5 minutes or something. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm thinking, and it's actually been very exciting. And one of the reasons that it's been very exciting is because in the middle of working on this project, this year, in the middle of the year, Brazil enacted the statute for racial equality. So it's been a kind of an interesting, very, very rapid change in attitude in Brazil about the question of race discrimination. So the story that caught my attention that made me want to look into this more was actually a story about police harassment in the northeastern city where I was living. And so in 1998, a dark-skinned Afro-Brazilian man with dreadlocks, whose name is Americo da Conceição, and I'll show you the newspaper clipping that got me interested in it. There's Americo, and there's the lawyer, everybody. He was falsely accused of robbing a bank about 150 miles north of Salvador, Bahia. The police officer who arrested him called him a degenerate black. I'm not going to say the words in Portuguese because it's very insulting. And beat him. At least one witness testified that he heard the officer make pejorative statements such as "shut your mouth" and the equivalent of NR, and offensive language. When Americo told the police officer he was from Bahia, Americo reported in his interview with me that the officer responded, "There are only thieves in Bahia." So you see the intersection of the color and the region. Americo's image was broadcast on television, and his photograph appeared in the newspapers, identifying him as a bank robber. There's a picture I took of him. Later that day, Americo's wife arrived at the police station, obtained his release, and reminded him that her brother had also been detained for a crime he did not commit, had retained an attorney, and won a settlement from the state. Americo went to the same lawyer, the one in the picture that I showed you there, and filed a lawsuit against the state of Sergipe. He alleged unjust imprisonment, false and unjust imprisonment, in large part motivated by racism. Here's a little thing that just struck me as so quintessentially one of the big differences between Brazil and the United States. We're having an interview. We're chatting away. I'm recording it, thank goodness, because I would never remember everything that happened. And, we're chatting away, and he's telling me all about this racism and this police officer and what he called him these names, and he beat him, and this is just horrible, and there's all this racism in Brazil. And I asked him, was the police officer white? And he said, no, mesmo cor, same color as me. And it was fascinating to me, because if I had not asked him, he wouldn't have told me. Whereas if that were to happen in the United States, that would be the first thing that we would talk about. We'd be like, how could that happen? How could that be? This is terrible. How do we analyze that in relation to communal solidarity, African American community, all the things that we think about in the United States? Even though it's true there are black police officers who harass black men in the United States, it's something that we pay attention to, as opposed to in Brazil, where it's just, America was a real sociologist. Dr. Haas would be proud of him. Because when I said to him, so the police officer was black, that's amazing, that's really interesting, he then says, it doesn't matter. And then he makes an argument for structural racism, right? And he points out that it doesn't matter what color the police officer is, because it's about this structure. He doesn't use the word structural racism, but that's what he's talking about. So, anyway, he won the case. Let me just finish that up. The judge issued a decision, the judge never mentions color or race discrimination in his decision, but in typically Brazilian fashion, says, I do not see how one can deny the moral damage suffered by the plaintiff in the name of public security under the authority of police activity. The police, more than any other citizen, must have the intellectual, physical, and moral preparation to sustain emerging social pressures. That's the way to talk about color. Until lately, now this is back in 2000, now things have changed very, very drastically. Brazil is, and in the work that I've done, in the research that I've done, I present why it's a no-brainer that black men in Brazil, we know that black men in Brazil are harassed 100% more than white men in Brazil. And I have all the statistics on that. But after 2002, we have this great upsurge of interest in Brazil in affirmative action. And affirmative action is actually put into place in a number of places. So you've got universities with quotas, and you've read all of that, about that kind of stuff. But I would say, and so then what happens is that even though there's a law against racism in Brazil, it doesn't really get used very much because it requires the kind of proof that nobody's basically about calling people names or disrespecting them, and it's usually one person's word against another, and whether there are witnesses. So people started bringing lawsuits in labor courts. And Brazil has a system of labor courts that are separate from the rest, and charging discrimination, employment discrimination. This is the first time in Brazil when people are charging employment discrimination. And then I discover that the people are also using the state courts to get damages for false imprisonment, which is almost always related to color. So in 2010, Brazil finds itself with a population, including public officials, substantially more cognizant of the problems that structural racism pose to the well-being of the country. And Tellus calls it a momentous shift in Brazil's racial politics. And what's really critically different today in Brazil is that the debates, they're having debates about color and race and color, issues that until very, very recently were never to be addressed openly in the public sphere. And just to point out that in 2010, we did have this, the signing, actually, when I was in Brasilia, when President Lula signed this law, the statute of racial equality. And it includes, even though they took out a whole lot of stuff, I mean, this law does not have a lot of teeth, let me tell you, that's a whole other talk. But they left in the requirement that police departments adopt measures to prevent police violence against the black population. So I'm going to stop there in case anybody wants to ask any questions.